Hello and welcome to Farm Connections. I'm your host, Dan Hoffman. On today's episode, we feature a roundtable discussion with experts in the field of mental health to discuss the serious impacts depression and anxiety have on all of us. Joining us will be Adrienne Desutter, Joshua Jensen, and Monica McConky. In addition to that, the University of Minnesota Extension provides us with a new best practices, all here today on Farm Connections.
Welcome to Farm Connections with your host, Dan Hoffman.
Farm Connections made possible in part by
Absolute Energy. A locally owned facility produces 125 million gallons of ethanol annually, proudly supporting local economies in Iowa and Minnesota. Absolute Energy, adding value to the neighborhood. Minnesota Corn Growers Association, working to identify and promote opportunities for corn growers, enhance quality of life, and help others understand the value and importance of corn production to America's economy. EDP Renewables North America, owner-operator of Prairie Star and Pioneer Prairie Wind Farms, Minnesota and Iowa. EDPR wind farms and solar parks provide income to farmers and help power rural economies across the continent.
Welcome to Farm Connections. Today's episode deals with mental health. We have some wonderful professionals with us. Josh. Hi, Josh. Welcome to Farm Connections.
Hey, Dan. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Monica, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. It's good to be here.
And Adrienne, thanks for joining us.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be here. Pleasure to have these types of conversations.
Well, certainly mental health takes many facets and many things happen within mental health. But Josh, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your experience with and what you do inside of that world.
Yeah. So I work here in southeastern Minnesota out of Rochester's Umber Valley Health Center. I'm our community liaison. And so what I do for work is I do some administrative oversight for our regional mobile crisis team, specifically our hub in the Rochester and a couple other surrounding counties. I do some regional suicide prevention work. And so I go around and I educate individuals on how do we recognize potential warning signs of suicide? How do we ask someone about suicide? How do we persuade someone to get help? And how do we make an effective referral? And the other part of, I guess, my line of work is I do resiliency-based trainings based off Dr. Amit Sood's stress management and resilience training.
Thank you. We'll come back to you. Monica?
Hi, I own my own company called Eyes on the Horizon Consulting. And my primary contract is with the Minnesota Farm Business Management Program. So I do outreach and counseling with farmers and farm families throughout the state of Minnesota. So that's why I'm in my truck right now. I'm in between a couple of farms. My background, I've been in the behavioral health field for 25 years, doing both direct service work as well as administrative positions in a couple different agencies.
Thanks, Monica. Adrienne?
Well, this is the hardest question for me. Who are you? What do you do? Because I think something that's so important for me and something we need to recognize more in agriculture is that we are more than our jobs. We are more than just the industry. There's so much more to us. So more than anything, I am a farm family cheerleader. I have a master's degree in counseling and was a school counselor before I decided to stay home with my kids. We have 3 young kids and 1 more on the way. So we're just kind of in that phase of getting them through home life and into school and stuff. So, but I've always really believed in wanting people to see the best in themselves. And so when I married a farmer, met him about 10 years ago and entered into the world of ag, it was an eye-opening experience for me. I grew up in rural Illinois, but wasn't involved in agriculture. So it was a very interesting perspective, seeing this unique and beautiful lifestyle, but how different it is and how stressful it can be. So, my family lost a family friend to suicide and was going through some of our own stresses, and just felt like we needed to make this conversation a little more normal, not just for ourselves, but for everyone in the industry. So I just speak out on farm stress, mental health, all things, farm family.
So I heard a friend once talk about it this way. He suffers from mental health, and he said, Dan, some people have heart issues, some people have mobility issues. I have mental health issues. It brought a new light to it. So, Josh, can you tell us what's the most successful story you've had? And I know you have to be very confidential about the work you do, all three of you, but can you share a real success story in your work?
Yeah. I've worked with quite a few people who, they were entering into adulthood. They grew up with their fair share of, traumatic experiences, and they struggled to form healthy relationships. And their life was essentially in shambles due to mental health struggles, right? So depression, anxiety, maybe there's something a little bit more severe, such as bipolar disorder, in addition to maybe a substance use disorder. And there's a few particular individuals who come to mind that I worked with. And while I was working with them, you saw them really take control of their mental health. They developed effective coping skills. They followed through with recommendations from treatment. They took medications when needed, right? Because medications aren't always needed, but for a lot of people they are. And the other part of that too is they started to depart from shame that they had historically experienced. And then they started to really flourish, if you will. And so there's been a few instances where I've seen that. And then they move on to become peer supports. They go back to school, and they have families now. And so obviously, like you said, I got to be discreet without giving too much information, but I would say those particular individuals that come to mind, that's their story, or the nuts and bolts of it.
You used the word anxiety. What does it mean, and how does it show itself?
Anxiety is tricky. And so when we can have performance anxiety. So think about like a test. Academics, right? Perhaps you're anxious and it's almost more nervousness. When we look at clinical anxiety, we're actually looking at an enlarged amygdala, which controls our freeze, fight, or flight response. And what that looks like, it can look like racing thoughts. It can look like physiological sensation. So I'm someone who has generalized anxiety and panic disorder, and how it manifests in me is I start to experience like a tingly sensation. I find myself pacing, biting my fingernails, tapping my feet. I have a hard time focusing. I can become irritable and a little bit moody, if you will. And so anxiety has many different faces, and people can experience in social situations. They can experience it with maybe they're focused on like their health, or let's take farmers, for example. And we look at where there's a drought going on, let's say northern Minnesota. Someone might experience anxiety based on a poor crop yield. How is that going to impact their family? How is it going to impact their community? There's anxiety tied to that, because you want to be a provider, you want to give back, and it's essentially your job to have a harvest, but you're not in control necessarily of how bountiful that harvest is.
Monica, you work statewide, so we might have some regions in the state where they have a bountiful harvest and a great price, and other places where there's absolute devastation. Can you build on what Josh just said?
Yeah, I think he, hit the nail on the head as far as farmers being impacted by things outside of their control. So things like commodity prices and weather and, interest rates, or whole regulations, a whole long list of factors outside of their control that really determine some year's success or failure in their operation. So the challenge is to how do they work within those uncontrollables without the anxiety or the depression really becoming so intense that they're struggling to find a way through. So I think another important point to think about is even farmers that have bountiful harvests or have successful livestock operations still struggle. So it's not, I get that question all the time, like, oh, prices are up, you must be going down. And farm stress is not all about finances. There are many, many layers of farm stress that impact our egg producers and their families every day, finances being one piece. So I do think it's important for us to remember that too, that even on a quote unquote good year, we can have people that are still really struggling.
Josh, can you talk a little bit about signs of depression, signs of mental health stress, or signs of anxiety, and how do we read so we can be helpful?
Yeah, and so it's going to vary from person to person, but we look at hopelessness. We could look at someone who perhaps is saying things like, "What's the point of this? Right? I can't do this anymore. I'd be better off dead." Right? You can look at sleep disturbances, people who maybe are struggling to sleep and get adequate rest. You could look at increase in alcohol consumption, moodiness, and maybe isolation. Isolation can be a big one, especially for men, right? We're not always good at expressing how we feel. And so instead of trying to do that, we may isolate from our family. You can look at other facets of maybe there's a lack of enjoyment in previously enjoyable activities. So whatever someone may find enjoyment in, maybe fishing, hunting, it could be going out with the family, whatever the case is, and all of a sudden this person is really struggling to do that, or maybe they don't even want to do it at all. You look at hygiene. Is someone eating regularly? Are they taking care of themselves physically, emotionally, spiritually? Any kind of deviation in what we would call like normal behavior can be a potential warning sign. And the more signs we observe, typically it's the greater the risk that someone's at, that they're experiencing a mental health crisis. And one of the things to do is it's easier for us to ask a question and have someone respond to that question and say, yeah, I'm really struggling, than it is for someone to just outright say, like, I'm struggling, I'm having, or I'm experiencing depression, I'm experiencing anxiety, or I'm having thoughts of suicide.
Tell us about kid mental health or children mental health.
Absolutely. I work with several farm youth, which has been really awesome because I was a farm youth. So I have that connection with them with 4-H and FFA and, animals and stress and how that trickles down to our kids. And there are many different traumas that kids experience on the farm, anything from, injuries and accidents to deaths to natural disasters. And that is a layer on top of just everyday stress, the stress of losing the farm that hangs over a lot of kids' heads all the time, the stress that their parents are under and how that trickles down and impacts the mom and dad's ability to parent. And so, yeah, very, very prevalent in our farm youth. And you'll see similar signs, it depends on the age. The younger the child, signs and symptoms will be more apparent in their behavior. So they're acting out and don't have the tools to process or describe what's going on for them, right? So it's their behavior. So it's important to remember that when a child is having a behavior, there's a function to that behavior. So we need to look a little deeper before we're quick to just, discipline based on the behavior. It's like, okay, where is that coming from and what's underneath it? When you get a little bit older with teenagers, the emotional part of their brain, Josh talked about the amygdala, that is developing very, very quickly. And the thinking part of their brain is not. And so they do a lot of things impulsively or out of emotion. And that doesn't always fly very well on a farm when you need somebody to be compliant for safety issues or, getting the chores done on time or being dependable and out in the field or what have you. So there's definitely, it's kind of a good recipe for conflict with your adolescents on the farm. But they can show similar warning signs. A lot of them will be emotionally based. So outbursts of anger, isolation, There may be, of course, the extreme would be suicidal gestures. I think the biggest thing is that we really take time to develop a relationship with our kids. Farm youth are more isolated than their urban counterparts, their urban peers. And so I think it's important that they have that network around them, both family and outside of the family, in the community and school, that is in touch with them and in tune with them.
Good information, Monica. Moving to Adrienne. Adrienne, you're a young parent with young children in the home. Are children equipped well enough to handle mental health stress, whether it's their own or their family members?
It was so interesting hearing Monica talk about this, and I'm over here chuckling and laughing because my husband's been harvesting now they've been out over a month. I know we haven't had him home hardly at all. I think we had a week of rain in there. So it's been about a month and a half with a week of him home. And it's amazing to see the difference in my kids' behaviors. I have a 1-year-old, a 3-year-old, almost 4-year-old, and a 5-year-old at home. And my husband and I just last night were talking about how they're a little more irritable. They're a little bit on edge right now, the kids are. And they, as Monica said, they don't know how to say, I miss my dad. They don't know how to say, this life is different. This routine is different than what we were used to. And kids thrive on routine. Humans thrive on routine, but especially young kids. So definitely, even if they're not seeing a stressed out dad, they're certainly seeing stressed out mom because she's parenting by herself right now, And so it absolutely, there's that ripple effect. But the neat thing is we also have the ripple effect in a positive way too. We can also, as parents, model that good behavior and model that stress is okay, that we acknowledge things are different, and we can talk about that with our kids no matter how young they are. My 3-year-old, almost 4-year-old, she gets that. It's okay for me to say, I'm sorry, mom made a mistake. I yelled a little too much right there. That probably wasn't the best way to handle that. And we can do that in the way we treat our kids. We can also model that for each other. Those of you maybe who don't have children at home, I think one of my favorite things that we've done in our home is we've made decisions not just for ourselves as parents and as a married couple, but also for the other person. So our initial decision to start speaking out was partially to help other people, as I said, and to really make this conversation more normal for other people. But also I needed my farmer husband, who is a strong-willed, irritable man. He's your typical farmer, right? I needed him to know that he wasn't the only one that was going through this. And so that was part of our mission, was to kind of make those choices and those decisions for each other too. I also, not long ago, decided I would see a therapist because that's something that's a little bit uncomfortable for anyone. As a counselor, I was uncomfortable even, picking up that phone and making those arrangements. But I knew that if I did it for me, then my husband also saw, again, that it's normal, that you don't have to be in the midst of depression or anxiety. I just wanted to work on myself. I just wanted to be a little bit better parent, be a better spouse, do some things a little bit differently. And I wanted him to see that again, you don't have to be at your rock bottom to reach out for some help and some resources. So again, we can really make a difference, not just in the way we handle stress, but we rub off good and bad with our kids, no matter what.
Well said. And a website or phone number we can reach you, Adrienne?
Yeah, the best way to reach me is through social media at this point. I was pretty heavily involved on Twitter and Facebook at So Hope Grow Hope, SOW, So Hope Grow Hope. But I will say that with my kids and being pregnant, I'm not on as much as I used to be, but that's kind of been my main source. And I have a website coming that's, again, sohopegrowhope.com. But you can reach me just through those social media outlets. And I am happy to, it's been so enjoyable, again, the last few years, was something that for me just started as advocating for some of our local farmers and getting involved in our state, and has now become an international opportunity for me to do presentations and things, and just to kind of, again, put a little pep in our step in the ag industry. So happy to help with those types of conversations.
Thank you, Adrienne. And thank you, Josh, Monica, and Adrienne for being on Farm Connections today and sharing your story.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you. Dan.
Stay tuned for more on Farm Connections.
Farm Connections Best Practices, brought to you by
Hi, I'm Dave Bau with the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm an extension educator in ag business management, and this is today's best practice. I do a lot of rent talks and have a lot of questions around the state every year. And so we're going to talk about best practices for rent, because rent is the biggest input for farmers in both corn and soybeans. For the last 10 years, rents accounted for 30% of gross of the corn income, and on beans, 41%. And so a lot of people set their leases based on percent of gross, but the farmers can, if they can manage their lease costs, they're basically managing their biggest input costs. So it's really a hot topic every year, what that rental rate should be. Our corn and bean prices have gone up dramatically right now, so rents are on their way up as they correlate to the corn and bean prices, but the farmers' expenses are up as well. Increase in corn and over $50 an acre increase for beans next year. So the input costs are going up. So that's where rent becomes really a challenging situation. Last year I used budget to 205. This year I used 245 for 2022, but those rental rates are much higher in different parts of the state. And also there's a big range. The trends right now on rents, they're increasing from the adult farm management program in 2019 and 2020. They increased 2%. And the USDA comes out with an estimate every year. And the 2021 estimate came out in September of this year. And their rate of increase from 20 to 21 was 8.5%. So those are the trends I use when I talk about the rent talks. So I encourage farmers to think about those trends. But the rents are going up even higher than that, I hear in many instances, because of our corn and bean prices. So farmers can work together with the landlords and try to control costs, maybe do a flexible lease. If you look at the input costs and going up dramatically too, corn yields, say if you use a high yield of 200 bushels an acre and we use a percent of gross of 30%, 30% of 200 bushels is 60 bushels. So if we use $5 corn, which some places can get that right now, we're a little bit under that in the current market where I'm at this morning, that would be $300 an acre rent. So that's a push for the rent. But if I use beans and we use $12, even if I use a third of the crop and we'll use a round figure, we'll use 60 bushels. So a third of that crop would be 20 bushels. 20 times 12 would only be 240. So you average those two out and you're going to be in the 270 to 275 range. So that's kind of where rents would be based on historical trends. But again, farmers are always trying to keep their costs down. And again, the rent is the biggest input cost they have for both corn and beans. And so it's hard for the landlords and farmers to get together on that number. I've been encouraging more flexible leases in place of fixed rates, because that allows it to adjust up and down as the income goes up and down. I had a discussion with a farmer this weekend. These high rents are taking all of his income away. So if you look at the numbers at 245 rent, there's about $160 an acre profit for the farmer. But if you take $100 away from that, or $50 away from that, farmers aren't making anything in the good times, which right now, if these high prices would be good times, should be good times for farmers. So best practices would be try to negotiate a fair rent between the landlord and the farmer, to control their largest input cost, and try to make it fair for both parties. Encourage both the farmers and the landlords to attend one of my rent workshops. There's actually 32 of them across the state in person. They start as early as November 3rd up north. My first one's in the center on November 4th, and there's one up north on November 3rd. And they go all the way through February of next year. We do the in-person ones. I have 24 of them in person, starting, like I said, November 4th, and they end up in Pipestone on December 15th. And then we're going to do regional Zoom meetings, 2 a day, once a week, starting in Rochester, Wilmer, Mankato, Hutchinson, Worthington, and Farmington are the areas we're going to cover each day. So if they don't want to do in person, which people are still COVID cautious, you can attend one of those Zoom meetings later on, starting January 7th with a Rochester presentation for that area. So I encourage both farmers and landlords to go through the workshop. It's about an hour and a half of your time. It'll go through lots of numbers and trends and help you make that decision. That's my best practice for the day. This is David Bau with the University of Minnesota Extension. I'm an extension educator in agricultural business management.
These last few years have been tough on all of us. Be sure to look after your friends and families and provide the support they need. And most importantly, make sure to look after yourself. I'm Dan Hoffman. Thanks for joining us on Farm Connections.